presentation. I will briefly introduce some cases from different countries and try to have a generalization of how we think of what is SSE at the Continental Network, REPES. So I will do people see my presentation? Can you see nods if they do? Okay, I think, okay. I will just go on, stop me if something is not right. So I will briefly introduce a case from Japan to start off with to introduce what we think of SSE in Japan and try to put that into context so that we can generalize from that. And then I will also show a case, show a couple of cases, not really in specific, but just to introduce the differences, some cases from the United States, and show a comparison and try to draw out the core of what we think of SSE. So going straight in, if some of the I'm sure some of the people attended the SSE Academy that Dr. Ben just introduced, that was held on the Friday, last Friday. And in that, there was a case study on a job support network in Shizuoka. Now, I'm going to introduce this again, just so some of the people know about the case study and we can dive into the depth of this. So for the people who were not there, the Youth Job Support Network of Shizuoka is a network that is structured in the prefecture of Shizuoka, which is a mid-sized prefecture in Japan, right in between Nagoya and Tokyo. It's a mid-sized city, but there's issues of unemployment because a lot of the economic activities have been drawn to the bigger cities like Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo. So there is a declining economy, and there are many people who are looking for jobs but cannot find jobs. And this network supports those that are employed in training, job hunt, and also consultation. And the network drives a portion of the budget from government contracts to do this employment support program or trainee programs, along with some subsidies in addition to its usual project revenue. And the network has over 1,600 volunteers who assist in these activities, and they're aiming for much more than that. And what they do is that these volunteers form buddies, and essentially they walk the neighborhood along with the people who are seeking support. And in that process, they introduce the people to the people of other people within the communities, introduce them to potential job offers or other volunteers. And by doing that, they support, so people who are unemployed oftentimes do not have the social network of support. They do not have family members who can offer them lucrative jobs, or they have limited networks of friendships or familial ties. And by walking the neighborhood, the volunteers are able to connect those who are seeking jobs with the broader community, so that even if they are not able to search jobs immediately, they still have people whom they can talk to, whom they can consult, and it offers a broader network of support for the individuals rather than just this organization helping the individual. And the employment is usually found at locally owned enterprises, and this creates a positive impact on a local economy. So with this, what this network does essentially is they find people who are looking for employment, and they connect it with those in the local communities who are looking for employment. And they do that through building networks of trust within the communities. Now, who pays for these operations? That's a very difficult part because the unemployed usually don't have the money to pay for that service. And the local businesses, because the economy is declining, it's very difficult for these local businesses to offer a kickback for the network. So the network very much rests on the government subsidies or government contracts to offer these services. But so when you look at this, not so sustainable in terms of the enterprise. But when we look at it in a macro scale, this network essentially enhances the local economy by searching jobs for the individuals and also tying it to local enterprises. That creates a stimulus effect for the local economy, which then in the long run would connect to increased tax revenue, which then comes back to the organization through the government's redistribution effects. So if you look at this organization individually, it may not seem that economically sustainable as an economic enterprise, but it has a more broader effect in stimulating the local economy, the local social capital, and creating networks amongst the individuals in the communities. And if you put this into context, I want to pose this question of, so who assures life in a pursuit of happiness in a society? And I think of this through the three elements of the society: state, the government on the left bottom corner, the community, and the market. Now, in a post-war Japan, it was a more communitarian model where the communities, including the family, had to take care of those in need. And the role of government was very small, and the role of markets were very small as well. So if you were in need, it was the communities that offered a lot of support. Then as the government gained more of its power in the Reconstruction, we constructed a welfare state where the government took a more aggressive role in supporting individuals in need. And when that happened, the role of the community began to diminish. But then after a while, they said, oh, governments are not so effective. And the neoliberal model kicks in, whereby the market's influence becomes much bigger. So the idea was you get a job, then the markets will cover for your needs efficiently. Was a neoliberal idea. But the thing is, when the neoliberal model takes place and the market is growing, it's fine, seems fine at the moment. But when markets collapse, companies all of a sudden don't care for their employees, and they start firing people, they start laying off people, and they don't cover the welfare of their employees that well. So that creates a void where the government is not caring for the people, and the communities are not able to care for the people. The markets have basically given up on caring for the people. And this is the state where we're at in Japan for the last 20 years after the economic bubble collapsed in the 90s. So in this situation, where does SSE come in? So in this case of Shizuoka, it is based within the community, but it also works with the government, and it also uses market actors to also be involved. So with this, what happens basically is that the SSE works not only to fill the void through the use of community powers, but tries to also bring in state and market-based forces to cover for a broader social need. Now, in Japan, because we had a rather stable post-war era economic growth at a time, there is a notion of the welfare state. So there is an idea amongst Japanese people that, yes, there is a role of government in taking care of people. And also there is this level of trust towards markets, and they understand some level of efficiency that markets also provide. That's a general understanding amongst the Japanese people. So there is a strong trust in the role of government, and markets are also understood as a worthwhile experiment by the Japanese people. So in that sense, the critical aspect of SSE in Japan is create a working relationship with local governments while continuing with private sector experiments and revitalizing communities in the meanwhile. So it approaches all three elements and tries to re-envision the relationship between governments, communities, and markets. So in history, it was first the communitarian society, then it became the welfare state, which began to look more like a socialist economy. And then there was backlash that went to the neoliberal side, and where the markets began dominating. and the markets falter, and the void becomes huge. And so the idea is not to recreate that history, but to re-envision how the three elements or the three actors would come together. And what happens is when we try to just fill the gap through community and community-based efforts, then the society still comes up with gaps. And it's a nostalgic return to a minimal government and market, and it is oftentimes also known as a third sector approach, but that itself is not necessarily the direction that SSE activists are trying to bring in. So it is not just to replace the three actors, it is the act of looking at ways to restructure the three actors so that the void does not exist within the society. It's about finding overlaps and spaces of engagement in the social system. So that's kind of where we're at in Japan, in a historical context, and more broadly speaking in terms of the generalization of what we think of SSE. Now, moving on to the United States as an example, I'll try to keep it short. SSE in the United States, we have the power of the Black cooperatives in the Deep South. So these are states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, those in the southeast corner, but excluding Florida because Florida is a whole different world of its own. And in these Deep South, so these are essentially states where slavery was prominent. And it was those states that wanted to protect slavery and fought a war for that purpose. But if you look at the cooperative movement by the Black people in these states, so they're so-called the Deep South. For example, there's a Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, which was set up in the late 1800s. So this is over 150 years old. But at the peak, there were over 1 million members in the South in this cooperative. And it is now carried on as a different name called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And it is a network of mostly Black members supporting each other through this cooperative institution. And we also had a network of cooperatives called the Young Negroes Cooperative League, also in this area. And this was a league of cooperatives. So it's a network of cooperatives that really organized men and women to survive through the Depression and move into the civil rights movement in the process. And even more recently, there's a Southern Consumers Cooperative in Lafayette, Louisiana, which was founded in 1961. So this is also before Blacks were able to vote. And why these cooperatives needed to exist is very important. And that's because even if slavery was legally banned, white power still dominated the Black lives. And we see the backlash still to this day. And before the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, the Black people could not vote, so they could not really rest on the state to help them. On the other hand, government was actively finding means to exploit Black bodies. Even if they cannot put them as slaves, they were still finding ways to exploit the Black people. And economically speaking, the whites had a massive economic power, so they used it to exploit Black bodies. So they would put the Black people in debt so that they would have to keep working, even if it's not legally slavery. They had no choice because they would owe debt to the white people. And so in that situation, the Black people needed a way to have self-governance, self-determination, and the means for doing that was by organizing, was by holding hands together and forming cooperatives that would then be a fair economic institution against the Black people. And so cooperatives were instituted, many of them were instituted out of necessity, out of a means of survival, out of a means of self-determination in these Black neighborhoods in the Deep South. And this quickly transitions after they're able to create some sort of economic self-determination economic survival, this quickly builds into the civil rights movement that leads up to their then not the economic self-determination, but also the political self-determination. And so if you compare the history of SSE, what we both consider SSE in Japan and the US, there is this hugely different phenomenon going on, where in Japan, it is about empowering local governments to act on their mandate, and it is about taming the markets to draw experimental solutions to social problems. And SSE is a means to engage diverse actors so that the support network becomes robust and thick. Whereas if you look at the cases in the US, in the Deep South, SSE was finding a means to fight against state-led exploitation. It was a means to create self-determination through the use of cooperatives, using market-based mechanisms to sustain livelihoods and gain political power. And SSE as a means to use was to solidify identity-based communities, in this case, Black communities, would use cooperatives to bond between their self-identities, and it wasn't necessarily to diversify. So these are hugely different experiences that the Japanese case and the US-based cases have, but within the continental network, we both consider these SSE, and we both consider these valuable historical lessons in SSE. So what makes them part of the same movement? And this was also mentioned in Dr. Ben's message, but we have this basic understanding that all the institutions in SSE care for the people and the planet and also economic sustainability. And there's also a point about governance, how people within the communities or people engaged in the institutions get to make the decisions and how they can participate in the process, in the political process. And then there's the edifying values, supporting members of the community, mutual support and reciprocity. These things are what is common as opposed to what the motives are within the, or the target strategy of each SSE institution in the countries. And then there's also a strong will to re-envision the society. So it is about working not by the institution itself, but to try to realign the actors within civil society, within the communities, but also with governments and markets. And how do we envision a different society? Not like the one we have right now, where people are suffering, but how can we create institutions that would then change the relationship with existing actors so as to transform the society? This transformative part is what we value at REPES and what we think is different in the SSE movement as opposed to a third sector approach. So with that, I'll end my brief introduction to what we define and think of as important parts of SSE through the intercontinental network comparison with 2 countries.